Opening the center, this pawn thrust immediately invites tactical skirmishes and sets the stage for active piece development. Instantly challenging White's central dominion, this Sicilian defense opens a rich, asymmetrical battlefield rife with counterattacking potential for Black. Developing the knight to a central square prepares for pawn advances and contests the d4 square, a hallmark of the open Sicilian. Preparing a fianchettoed bishop offers excellent long-term diagonal control, though it momentarily weakens the kingside pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop eyes the d7 square, aiming for a swift kingside attack while preparing to castle. Developing the bishop to g7 fianchetto establishes control over the long diagonal and prepares for kingside castling, securing the monarch. Securing d4 allows expansion and pins down the center, creating a solid foundation for a queenside initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the knight, this move fosters harmonious piece deployment and challenges White's ambitious pawn advance. Unlocking the center with aggressive intent, this pawn thrust immediately escalates the central struggle and claims vital space. Opening the c-file is a direct challenge, inviting a fight for central control and potentially exposing the d4 pawn. Opening the c-file with 6. Cx-d4 immediately challenges Black's pawn chain and grants White a more central pawn presence, preparing for rapid piece development aimed at controlling key squares. Developing the knight to its most active square, this move pressures White's center and prepares to castle, a key step in securing the king. It also opens lines for potential piece play, making the board more dynamic. Securing the central pawn presence and preparing to castle, this knight's deployment asserts pressure on the d5 square and develops a key piece efficiently. King safety finally addressed, the Black monarch finds refuge behind a pawn wall, simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks or the redeployment of pieces like the rook for central influence. Shifting the bishop to b3 strategically vacates the c2 square, preparing to potentially redeploy the piece to a more aggressive diagonal later, perhaps aiming at the kingside or even a quick swing to the queenside if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously maintaining pressure on the d5 pawn structure and keeping an eye on Black's kingside development. Developing the knight to c6 reinforces the center and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Black is solidifying their position after White's solid central pawn push. Prophylactically fencing off the bishop's diagonal, White subtly addresses potential knight incursions on g4, a common theme in this structure, while also preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm that might develop later. Initiating a flank expansion, b5 aims to gain queenside space and potentially disrupt White's pawn structure, creating dynamic imbalances that could lead to active piece play for Black. Securing the monarch offers breathing room, preparing for potential pawn storms on the kingside and reinforcing the center's stability. The king now retreats from the long diagonal's immediate threats and finds a safer haven behind a solid pawn shield. Challenging the central structure immediately, Black seeks to disrupt White's comfortable pawn chain and open lines for piece activity before the opponent can solidify their queenside. This proactive approach gambles on creating chaos, aiming to outmaneuver White in a less organized position rather than allowing White to slowly build an advantage. Sharpening the tactical focus, White aims to pry open the queenside and exploit the potential outpost on d5, forcing Black into a defensive posture rather than continuing their queenside expansion. The Black knight, after a brief flirtation with the kingside, now decisively reroutes to a central square, immediately contesting White's advanced knight and opening a pathway for its comrade on c6. This exchange, though seemingly simplifying, will significantly alter the pawn structure and create new dynamics, particularly concerning the long diagonal leading to White's castled king. The ensuing pawn dance will be crucial. Sensing an opportunity, White captures the knight, not just to remove an attacker, but to strategically reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, creating a potential battery aimed at Black's castled king, and simultaneously securing the d5 square as a forward outpost that controls key central squares. Unleashing the bishop to c8, a subtle yet potent regrouping, This maneuver aims to leverage the open diagonal that will soon manifest. The dark-squared bishop, having served its purpose on g7, now seeks a more active role, potentially challenging white's central control or preparing for a queenside expansion. Observe how the pawn structure on the queenside is also influenced, creating opportunities for pawn pushes that can disrupt white's harmonious development and create weaknesses in their king's safety. Shifting the bishop to e3 offers improved diagonal coverage, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential kingside activity, while also creating a safe haven for the piece should black's knight aggressively advance. Asserting influence over the open c-file, this rook assumes an active post, challenging white's central control and potentially preparing for future advances along the ranks. Bringing the queen to the edge of the board, this maneuver aggressively pressures black's queenside pawn structure and eyes the now undefended a7 square. Black's decision to play e6 now firmly establishes a pawn chain, creating a defensive structure but also a potential weakness on d6. The queen's assault on a4 has been neutralized, and the focus shifts to solidifying the kingside and preparing for potential pawn advances or piece maneuvering in the center. This move signals a desire for a more robust defense, aiming to weather white's initiative rather than seeking immediate counterplay. It's a pragmatic choice, prioritizing king safety and organizational integrity over immediate pawn aggression. Retreating the bishop from that advanced square concedes the light squares near the king, potentially creating long-term weaknesses should black manage to open the h-file. The knight's audacious leap to the edge of the board aims to disrupt white's central control and pressure the queenside, potentially creating weaknesses for the bishop on b3. Shifting the knight to d2 prepares a potential advance of the c-pawn, aiming to crack open the queenside and gain space, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to reroute the knight to a more active square, perhaps via c4 or e4, depending on black's response. Black seizes the initiative by fracturing white's central pawn structure, opening critical lines for piece activity, and potentially creating a passed pawn on the d-file if white doesn't react precisely. Commanding the open c-file with the rook now allows white to apply pressure on black's queenside, a crucial strategic objective in this Sicilian dragon variation, as it aims to exploit the slightly exposed c-pawn and potentially unravel black's defensive setup. Seizing the opened c-file now becomes a primary objective, as the capture removes a defensive piece and opens a direct line for black's rook, promising more dynamic play. Opening the a-file with this recapture sets up a potential pressure point on black's queenside pawns, aiming to exploit the exposed nature of those squares. Exchanging the rook on the c-file immediately simplifies the position and invites a critical reevaluation of the open lines, potentially leading to a more active role for black's remaining pieces and forcing white to defend against threats along the now open rank. Reclaiming the crucial central file is paramount here, opening up avenues for your rook to dominate and exert pressure along the c-file. Black seizes the opportunity to simplify, clearing the d-file and opening a potential diagonal for the queen. But this exchange also brings the opposing rook onto the now open a-file, demanding careful attention to piece activity and potential discovered attacks. Unleashing a potent queenside attack, this bold capture on a7 creates immediate dynamic tension, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially fork the rook and bishop. Reclaiming the pawn structure and creating a more solid defensive pawn chain on the kingside, this placement of the bishop aims to control key squares, particularly the e4 and c4 diagonals, while also preparing for potential piece maneuvering and better knight development. It avoids immediate tactical skirmishes and focuses on long-term positional solidity. The queen's relocation to the 7th rank aggressively probes black's defenses, initiating a thrilling tactical skirmish where piece activity takes precedence over pawn structure. Unleashing the queen to the active a8 square offers a potent counter to white's recent rook foray, not only defending the bishop, but also preparing a potential counterattack through the open c-file or by eyeing the queenside majority. Unlocking the c-file and preparing a decisive infiltration, this knight maneuver aims to seize control of the central squares and disrupt black's queenside harmony. Sacrificing the queen here is a desperate attempt to consolidate after white's aggressive queen sortie, though it doesn't fully address the underlying pawn weaknesses and the exposed king. The rook now forcefully occupies the 7th rank, a powerful outpost that immediately challenges black's coordination and creates significant threats against the isolated pawn structure. This piece placement ignites a fierce battle for control of the open files and puts immediate pressure on black's defenses, forcing a careful reassessment of their defensive setup as white aims to exploit the queenside weakness. With the rooks exchanged, this strategic decision injects dynamism into the position, aiming to activate the king's pawn and challenge the central pawn structure that has been solidified by white. The immediate goal appears to be generating counterplay and preventing white from dominating the opened lines. This knight repositioning aims to consolidate white's central presence, eyeing potential outpost squares and preparing to support an advance on the kingside or exploit the weakened light squares around black's monarch. Unleashing a pawn forward with aggressive intent, black seeks to disrupt white's tightly packed pieces and potentially create a new attacking avenue on the kingside, sacrificing central control for dynamism. Securing the central d-file with the bishop provides a crucial defensive anchor against black's encroaching pawns, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside or a repositioning to a more aggressive square. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight in this position decisively trades off a powerful attacking piece for a defensive one, simplifying black's position considerably and removing white's initiative. Indeed, the immediate endgame now favors black due to their superior pawn structure and the active rooks that can be brought to bear on the open files, a subtle but significant shift in the battlefield's landscape. Finally, the queens are off the board, initiating a transition to a more strategic endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. White's capture of the bishop on e5 reclaims the material imbalance and opens the d-file, a critical pathway for white's remaining rook to pressure black's queenside pawns. This development forces black to carefully consider the defense of their weakened pawn chain and the potential for white to exploit the open lines. Seeking to create immediate attacking potential, this pawn push aggressively probes white's central structure and attempts to open lines for the remaining pieces. Repositioning the bishop to g2 aims to activate it on the long diagonal, potentially targeting black's weakened kingside and offering a more dynamic attacking setup. Initiating a counteroffensive along the open file, this rook thrust aims to disrupt white's established queenside structure and potentially generate counterplay where none seemed immediately apparent. Solidifying control of the central light squares is the priority, preventing black's rook from becoming an active infiltrator on the c-file while simultaneously offering a potential outpost for the knight should it venture forward. Liberating the bishop from its restrictive diagonal and forcing a simplification creates an immediate pawn advantage, aiming to leverage the queen's active placement in the endgame. This retreat to a3 reestablishes the rook's presence on the open file, aiming to contest it and potentially create counterplay down that flank, while also offering some breathing room for the pawn structure on the queenside. The bishop's retreat to c4 skillfully repositions this piece, aiming to create a powerful battery along the a7-g1 diagonal and potentially harass the opponent's king further down the board. Securing that crucial open file with the bishop offers white a significant advantage, aiming to exploit the d-pawn's vulnerability and restrict black's limited piece activity. The bishop retreats, seeking refuge on a central diagonal, aiming to re-establish influence and potentially re-engage on the kingside or support a pawn push. Initiating a decisive push on the open file, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's unified pawn structure and potentially isolate pieces for tactical exploitation. Securing the rook's connection and aiming to activate the queenside pawns along the newly opened b-file, this maneuver proactively addresses the isolated nature of black's pieces and hints at future counterplay. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn push aims to create immediate complications and disrupt black's piece coordination by contesting the opened file and potentially freeing the rook. The black king bravely steps into the fray, seeking to activate a piece that has been conspicuously absent from the recent skirmishes, aiming to consolidate its position amidst the exposed pawn structure. A bold thrust, this check aims to dislodge the black king from its relatively safe position and force concessions, potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. The strategic intent here is to exploit the awkward placement of black's king and create immediate, tangible threats, forcing a reaction that might weaken black's pawn structure further or cede material in an attempt to avoid disaster. This isn't just about gaining time, it's about forcing black to defend under duress, potentially leading to tactical miscalculations as they scramble to protect their king. The pressure on the 7th rank, already significant, intensifies with this aggressive sequence. Bringing the king closer to the fray, the black monarch ventures into a more active role, aiming to bolster the pawn structure and potentially participate in the fight for the center that's starting to open up. This proactive positioning might signal a readiness to defend against any encroaching white pieces or to support a future pawn push. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank creates immense pressure on black's back rank, threatening to infiltrate and exploit weaknesses around the exposed king. Embracing the chaos, this pawn thrust, rather than reinforcing the king, injects immediate tactical complications, potentially opening lines for your king into the fray or, if mishandled, creating fatal weaknesses. Unleashing the pawn on the *F* file finally breaks open the central congestion, creating immediate activity and forcing black's king to contend with a more exposed position, while simultaneously opening a pathway for white's rook to potentially join the fray on the 7th rank. Releasing the pinned e-pawn offers a crucial tactical opportunity, potentially opening lines for your remaining pieces and creating dynamic counterplay against white's rook on the 7th rank. Pushing the rook to the 8th rank intensifies pressure on the weakened black kingside and opens a crucial line for potential infiltration. Focusing on activating the rook to a more central file, preparing for potential pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. The rook swings to the open 8th rank, a potent threat to disrupt black's pawns and exploit the weak dark squares, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential pawn advance. Sacrificing the bishop for a pawn feels like a desperate attempt to break free, but it leaves the remaining pawns awkwardly isolated and the king exposed to future threats. Unleashing a mating net with the rook's swift descent, white aims to shatter black's defenses by forcing the king into the open, a consequence of the recent pawn exchange. The black king, no longer shielded by pawns, finds itself a tempting target on the open g-file. The immediate priority is creating escape squares or solid defensive structures. A bold repositioning of the rook, aiming to escape the confines of its current pawn chain and eye the exposed black king. The pawn's advance to e2 fundamentally alters the material balance, creating a dynamic imbalance that could be exploited. Finding safety for your king becomes paramount now. Castling short into the storm just invited further trouble and exposed your monarch to potential tactical skirmishes. A moment of strategic surrender, the bishop retreats to a passive square, relinquishing control over the vital diagonal and offering little in the way of active defense or counterplay against white's encroaching pieces. The rook now finds a cozy spot on the 3rd rank, preparing to infiltrate the enemy's position and cause mischief. This forcing check disrupts white's king's safety and offers a promising pawn breakthrough, aiming to exploit the open files that have emerged from the recent exchanges and create crucial passed pawns. Initiating a rook lift to the 7th rank after a strategic pawn sacrifice offers white the chance to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially create new attacking avenues. Reactivating the rook to contest the central files, now that the enemy king is exposed and potentially vulnerable. The rook retreats, seeking a more active post on the open 7th rank, potentially eyeing the weakened pawn structure. Bringing the rook back to the 2nd rank is a masterful pivot, aiming to pry open the e-file and potentially create significant threats against white's positioned king. Unleashing the bishop to g7, black's fianchettoed king's bishop now eyes the newly opened long diagonal, potentially disrupting white's queenside pawns and seeking counterplay against the rook on the 7th rank. The rook now has a completely free rein, a dynamic presence that could threaten to cut off the white king's escape routes or support a desperate pawn push. Disrupting black's centralized rook and potentially opening lines for an attack on the now exposed king. The rook's relocation to the first rank is a subtle yet potent attempt to disrupt white's rook dominance on the now open b-file, aiming to create counterplay by potentially activating black's own rooks and offering a pawn exchange to simplify towards a more manageable endgame. Clearing the bishop's path to attack the rook now that the pawn chain has been fractured offers a dynamic shift, aiming to exploit the slightly misplaced black monarch. Sensing a glimmer of counterplay, black throws the rook forward, aiming to disrupt white's neatly arranged pieces and potentially activate their own dormant monarch. Guarding the king against the persistent checks, a crucial step in stabilizing the position. Pushing the h-pawn now aims to create an escape square for the king and potentially prepare a later advance to destabilize the opponent's pawn structure, but it feels a bit premature given the existing tension on the board. The pawn pushes forward, seeking to break open the king's defenses and exploit the exposed bishop. Injecting life into the king's defensive setup, this advance aims to disrupt white's control over the central files and potentially create counterplay by opening lines for the rook. The rook's repositioning to the second rank intensifies pressure on black's pawn structure, potentially setting up a decisive advance or a strong pinning maneuver. The rook's repositioning to the contested central file suddenly intensifies the pressure on white's isolated king, aiming to exploit the open lines created by the pawn exchanges. Securing the pawn on the king side now seems more pressing than reinforcing the passed pawn's advance. The immediate aftermath of the rook exchange leaves black with a significant material deficit, and the discovered attack by white's queen against the rook on d1 presents a dire situation.